few generations back, I was convinced because all my Greek friends used to say, don't postati. And the way it sounds is very Greek, of course. Nevertheless, this is not the case, 100%. Doro works as an associate professor at the St. Kyril's Coptic Orthodox Theological College. He's telling me that he's research director at an NGO by the name ISCAS, and that he was recently once more elected Selby Fellow at the University of Sydney. And he is going to be talking to us today about the crisis of knowing in Athanasius' Against the Gentiles. So we are all ears. Please, Doro.
Thank you, Eva. And thank you for the encouragement. Had a slow start this morning. I apologize for missing the early session. Now, I work on Athanasius of Alexandria since some years now. I have published a number of articles and book chapters on him, even fairly recently, 2021, in my monograph, Humankind and the Cosmos, Early Christian Representations. In a couple of chapters, I allocated sections on Athanasius, especially from the viewpoint of his theory of nature contemplation. And I built on that foundation towards a monograph. So what I'm presenting now is actually more like a summary, an overview of what I'm working on currently, including Bronwen left.
No, she's there.
She's there. Together with Bronwen and another colleague, we published in 2019 a book, Dreams, Virtue and Divine Vision in Early Christian Egypt. And my contribution to that book is also on Athanasius from the point of his spiritual or ascetic theology. So all that bleeds together into the project that I'm working on currently, including this summary. It appears that in search for their own identity, the early Christians were all about parting ways with everyone else, Jews and Gentiles alike, or at least this was the propaganda. The cultural attitude of this third race, as the 2nd century apocryphal work, The Preaching of Peter, has it in chapter 5, therefore is representative for what the ancients meant by crisis, namely to assess, to discern, to choose, to separate. No wonder the 2nd century treatise known as Letter to Diognetus, in the first 4 or 5 chapters, draws a sharp line extramuros, or outdoors, between the Christian worldview and ethos on the one hand, and the beliefs and practices of both Jews and Gentiles on the other hand. Let's give an example. In the author's words, I quote, "While living in either Greek or barbarian cities, depending on their lot and following the local customs in regards to clothing, food, and the other aspects of life, they, Christians, display, however, an astonishing and admittedly paradoxical condition of their way of life. Mingled with everyone else, they are different nonetheless. Much has been already said about the parting of the ways, of course, and perhaps we can look at least the classical work by Judith Lear, neither Jew nor Greek, but many others. So there's no reason for me to return to this matter here. However, I find it useful to follow for just a little while longer the idea of cultural crisis as assessment and separation. While many Christian authors of the 2nd and the 3rd century would primarily address the topic in terms of us, true believers, and them, false believers, where them includes both Jews and Gentiles, the 4th century marks a radical shift of perspective. In short, while at face value the rhetoric remained the same, the line was now drawn inside the church's backyard, intramuros, indoors. What caused this change is, without a doubt, the submission of the Christian Church to the empire under Constantine and his dynasty. This led to a degradation of Christian culture, for want of a better word, a lowering of standards theologically and morally. While some Christian authors, such as Eusebius of Caesarea in his Life of Constantine, saw the new circumstances as the arrival of the kingdom to come, others were suspicious. In reaction to these circumstances, critically, pardon the pun, many Christians chose to leave the institutional church in spiritual self-exile, if you wish. Monasticism became a mass phenomenon. Criticism became the dominant of ecclesiastical rhetoric, with authors such as Gregory the Theologian and John Chrysostom deploring the derelict state of church membership, clergy, and laity alike. And so, in words that clearly echo Diognetus, an anonymous work traditionally attributed to Macarius of Egypt, the Spiritual Homilies, undertook to redraw the line that earlier on separated Christians from everyone else, moving it indoors. As we read, that's from Homily 5. Although the Christian crowds, similar to the people of the world, Gentiles, believe that the difference and distinction refers to forms and signs, the strangeness of Christians does not consist in outward forms and signs. That's just an example to show that there were different understandings of what a Christian looks like in the 4th century, and there were people who were blinded by a certain attire, labels, brands, and so on and so forth, calling themselves Orthodox or otherwise. While for the author of the Macquarie Homilies, the true difference is within. It's an internal difference, a mindset, a way of life that doesn't require a certain habit to wear in order to show one's Christianity. The language is still us and them, but in this case, both true and false believers are within the church. This new development is of the essence for grasping Athanasius' messaging against the Gentiles. Closer to home, the revival of ancient traditions occasioned by the meteoric rise of Emperor Julian made obvious an interesting aspect of this 4th century development. More specifically, given the new circumstances where Christian intellectuals had less and less opportunities to show themselves in polite society, so to speak, the temptation exists among them to follow the emperor's suit, that is, to abandon Christianity and to return to the old ways. This temptation was not radically new. The 2nd century author Clement of Alexandria, as Daniel Worden puts it, wrote his exhortation to the Gentiles precisely in order to convince Christian intellectuals to remain faithful instead of seeking to join one of the so-called Gnostic schools. While the reasons for deserting the church varied, since imperial persecution, that's under Julian, and enthusiasm for gnosis are two different things, the Christian elites of Athanasius' time, especially during the reign of Julian, imitated their 2nd century predecessors. No wonder Athanasius, always the king's shepherd, as David Gwynne describes him, attempted to counteract the phenomenon by staving off the Christian intelligentsia's exodus. His strategy was as smart as Clement's. Instead of deploring the lowering of standards or accusing his readers of betraying their Christian vows, as many of his younger contemporaries did, he proceeded to criticize the Gentiles, as the title of the work under consideration shows. Given this apparent stance, careless readers usually take Against the Gentiles as yet another Christian apologetic treatise after the fashion of the 2nd and 3rd century. Nevertheless, emulating Clement's exhortation, Athanasius' work aims inwardly, not outwardly, targeting Christian intellectuals. Corresponding to the pseudo-Macarian spiritual homilies, albeit implicitly, it therefore identifies the false, or rather unconvinced believers as church members, not as outsiders. As such, It is a catechetical treatise whose motivation is pastoral, not a polemical apology. The view that Against the Gentiles targets Christian intellectuals rather than the Gentile elites is not new. It was first advanced by Eginhard Meyering based on internal evidence, then developed by Khaled Anatolius and John Baer, but more from the viewpoint of its association with the second treatise of this diptych on the Incarnation. Accordingly, both Anatolius and Baer call Against the Gentiles an apology for the cross. This designation does not exhaust Athanasius' complex strategy in the treatise under consideration, but spells out its catechetical nature. Given the pastoral and catechetical rather than missional scope of the work, I would rally, together with Andrew Louth and the sources he reviews, identifying as the date of its writing during Julian's time, around the 360s, not earlier. You know, most people, or most patristic scholars, would locate Against the Gentiles in the early days of Athanasius, when he was a teenager, which doesn't make any sense. Even the proposal of Khaled Anatolius that it was written in 336 or so, during Athanasius' first exile, I don't think it holds. In this light, to keep up with our topic, crisis. While from a distance the Athanasian crisis echoes the same all parting of the ways narrative, therefore an extramuros conflict, all the above signify a different story, where the crisis refers to an indoors issue that requires pastoral, though no less intelligent, management. I must now turn to the relevant point of Against the Gentiles. I agree with scholars such as Anatolius, Camelot, Meyering, and Weinandy that in Against the Gentiles, Athanasius asserts the superiority of Christian gnosis to any ancient ways of knowing. This assessment is valid regardless of the audience the treatise targets, whether Gentile or Christian elites. Against the Gentiles can be understood, therefore, either as an attempt to convert Gentile intellectuals or as an effort to convince Christian intellectuals to maintain their church membership. Either way, there is a crisis at the heart of this treatise. It has to do with matters epistemological, more specifically focusing on what makes the Christian ways of knowing superior to other ways. It is for this reason that at this juncture I shall put aside, until almost the end of this paper, what we learned so far about the treatise's target audience. Athanasius discusses in this treatise a range of ways of knowing against the backdrop of depicting Gentile culture as religiously and morally derelict, as well as philosophically imperfect. That's the first 27 chapters of his treatise. In turn, Christian gnosis is attained through faith, even the faith of the cross, and scriptural study, that's chapter 1, and by emulating the saints' way of life and desire to know God truly through unencumbered contemplation. The latter is possible due to the ascetically obtained purity of heart, chapter 2. Later in the treatise, Athanasius considers three ways of knowing, that is, introspection and soul travel, chapters 30-34, cosmic contemplation, chapters 35-44, and scriptural testimony, chapters 45-46. He mentions in passing that they complement each other, as for example when he highlights that if introspection and soul travel are difficult to handle, the same knowledge can be extracted from the contemplation of nature. He says this at the end of chapter 34. He returns to this topic towards the end, where he says something to the effect that what has been learned so far through knowing God introspectively and contemplatively finds confirmation throughout the scripture. Chapter 45. 45. A complete map of the various epistemological avenues Athanasius discusses falls outside the scope of this paper. I have mentioned them only in order to show that in Against the Gentiles, he pursues a consistent agenda, namely to prove the superiority of the Christian ways of knowing to other forms of acquiring gnosis. It is on this note that I turn to introspection, the soul's inward gaze, and the prerequisites of knowing. as an exemplification of what Athanasius considers clear signs of Christian superiority. First, Athanasius proposes that while the classical culture ended up by misrepresenting reality, the Christian worldview and way of life make possible humanity's return to more secure forms of knowledge, including through introspection. True, introspection is a philosophical exercise, Platonic, but he claims that when believers consider the soul directly without cultural mediation, they can see within themselves the central tenets of the Christian faith. In his words, the matters we have spoken of earlier regarding ancient religious and philosophical ideas have been refuted as nothing else but a strain away of people's life. The way of truth, however, aims at the God who truly is. For that knowledge and its unerring grasp, we only need to look into ourselves, he says in chapter 30. Usually scholars take these and other passages as denoting an unqualified optimism about the soul. But Athanasius speaks of a soul or mind, he alternates the two words, that is graciously enhanced, theologically guided, and ascetically purified. Only such a person can grasp reality in ways that exceed the achievements of both natural perception and ancient theories. As he points out, I quote, "Having within themselves faith in the kingdom of God, believers are readily able to gaze upon and perceive the King of the universe, Father's saving Logos." Chapter 30 again. Here, faith in the kingdom, which is another way of referring to divine grace, are characteristic of the Christian worldview, not natural givens. The same goes for Athanasius' points about, I quote, "cutting off all the stain of desire which they, people, have put on, as well as any foreign features of the soul," as chapter 34. Here, the reference to ascetically obtained purity comes to the fore, echoing what Athanasius says in chapter 2 about the saints, by which he means, as I showed elsewhere, desert ascetics. That's something that I picked up from David Brackey. He says that in most places, when Athanasius mentions saints, he refers to ascetics or angels. In the context of Against the Gentiles, there's no way of identifying the word saints with angels. So it must be desert ascetics, and I have written on this a couple of things, pointing out that at least when we compare Against the Gentiles with another work by Athanasius, Life of Antony, we realize that the saints in Against the Gentiles are actually Antony and his bunch of monks. Thus, while introspection is not a Christian contribution to the history of culture, the fact that Athanasius makes it dependent on faith, grace, and purification in the footsteps of the saints indicates a Christian reinterpretation of the practice. Athanasius does not describe introspection beyond this point, but he refers throughout chapter 30-34 to other ways in which the purified soul or mind of believers acquire gnosis. One is soul travel. As we read, I quote, "When the body rests in bed unmoved as though sleeping unto death, often the soul remains awake by itself, passing above and beyond that body's nature. And so, seemingly traveling away from the body, yet remaining within it, it pictures in its mind and contemplates unearthly things. Many times it encounters saints who are out of their earthly bodies and angels conversing with them without fear, due to the purity of its mind." That's chapter 33, a passage that is sometimes taken by scholars as having to do with dreams. I have written on this again, and I'm in the process of applying again and again to different journals to submit another development of that idea, being knocked down again and again, I assume, by one of the handful of people who work in this field and are upset by what I say. So it's not dreams.
We believe you.
Scholars take this passage as referring to dreaming, While I do not dismiss the possibility that certain aspects of soul travel refer to dreams, it appears to me that against the backdrop of the treatise, especially in the light of Athanasius' references to faith, grace, and purification, there is more to this and other passages. Soul travel appears to indicate extrasensory perceptions. At least this is what the text says when we consider it through the lens of another Athanasian work on sickness and health. In his words, I quote from this one, Sickness and Health, "The sleep of the saints is endowed with a vision of higher things, and while their body rests still on the ground, the mind goes through the outer places and flies up from the earth to the heavens. Thus, while Elisha, the great prophet, bodily lay down on the mountain, he followed Gehazi in his mind. In turn, Saint Daniel was vigilant in mind, even though bodily asleep, and so was able to see those great and divine visions." So that's on the Sickness and Health 7. That the two passages share a lot in common is obvious. And while in Against the Gentiles, for various reasons, Athanasius tends to be more indirect in what he wishes to convey, in On Sickness and Health, a work of an obvious ascetic nature, makes plain his meaning. Thus, soul travel is an effective way of acquiring knowledge, but only insofar as the travelers are saintly, purified ascetics. The journey of the soul is completed with a divine vision, but because I don't want to miss the opportunity of getting some questions, I'll skip this one. Chapter 34 is a large chunk there where he talks about, again, returning to God, willingly undertaking purification in order to put ourselves back on track for the divine vision, and ending with the divine vision, which entails a transformation of the human being in its entirety, mind, soul, body. So the idea is that we have in Against the Gentiles a progression from introspection to soul travel, various realms, and then divine vision. All these being conditioned by, let's call them Christian prerequisites like faith, grace, ascetic purification. Here again, the ascetic dimension of purification is clearly obvious. The Athanasian exploration of the soul captures aspects of human cognition that exceed natural aptitudes and spiritual exercises, philosophical exercises. It is in this light, or in the light of this conclusion, that he might have wished to encourage his readers, unconvinced Christian intellectuals, of the importance of continuing their Christian journey. As far as Athanasius is concerned, it seems, the crisis is now behind. Strenuous believers can confidently maintain their Christian identity. The rewards are great.
Thank you, Doru, for providing a fantastic connection with the conference I was attending last week. So I feel on top of that. Please, questions on personal crisis in the 3rd century?
Fourth
century. Shall I? Yes, please.
Thanks, Father Dora, for that. I just want to ask you a question, if you can make the connections. Basically, I'll just focus on soul traveling. If you see a connection, a possible connection in Athanasius with the Jewish mysticism of Hekalot, where we do have this soul traveling, the visitation of spheres, realms, and palaces. That's one side of the question. The other one is, I think that soul traveling is an experience much more developed in the West than the East, and I don't know if the presence of Athanasius in the West for a prolonged period might have affected that. And the third part of the question is,
Oh my.
yeah, the East. I mean, where this is rather not that strong, that sort of tradition. We have it in hagiographical literature a lot, but not in other sort of literature. Just draw some connections.
Yeah.
If you may.
Thank you, Vasily. Well, it's fascinating. Well, look, as we know, he grew up around Alexandria, and he must have gotten some education here, there, everywhere, like most Alexandrians would. And therefore, he was exposed to the ideas and the way of life of the very strong Jewish community of the city. So we have all the reasons in the world to confidently associate all the great Alexandrian thinkers from at least Clement, 2nd century, Origen, 3rd century, Athanasius, 4th, Didymus at the end of the 4th century, Cyril of Alexandria in the 5th century, with the Jewish community. Not as though they were Jews, but they were very much interested in, and people who actually learned from their rabbi confreres. So that's one thing. It shouldn't surprise us that there are similarities. Then Athanasius at some point issues an edict by which he prohibits the use by believers of apocryphal literature. The famous, I don't remember the number of the encyclical, the famous letter by which he establishes the canon of the New Testament. You can read only this stuff, don't read the other stuff. And there's stuff that he expels from Christian libraries, so to speak. One of them is the Ascension of Isaiah, which is a text that is still very influential, at least in Pachomian monasticism, so Upper Egypt. And as we know, Athanasius, during at least a couple of exiles, found refuge among the monks of Upper Egypt, where I'm certain he delighted in the literature that he found around. It's very close to Nag Hammadi and all that. I don't think we should be surprised by the fact that there are apocalyptic motifs present in his thinking. So there's the Jewish community to which he was exposed. There's the Upper Egypt monasticism that still maintains an interest in apocalypticism and so on and so forth. This work against the Gentiles, which I repeat, I would locate, chronologically speaking, towards the end of his career, not early in his career, illustrates this exposure to at least Ascension of Isaiah. And the idea doesn't belong to me. It was established by a great Orthodox scholar, now Archbishop Alexander Golitsyn. He wrote immensely about this, let's say, darker, unknown side of the Orthodox tradition in the 4th century. And he discovered parallels, explicit parallels between Athanasius's apocalypticism and Ascension of Isaiah. What was the last one? I don't remember the last one.
In the West.
The West. Well, yeah, that's again something that makes perfect sense. And thank you, Vasily. I didn't think of the impact of the West upon him. He spent so much time out there. All these gel well together. Jewish community, Upper Egypt monks with their interest in apocalypticism and the West. So no wonder that in later works like Life of Antony and Against the Gentiles, we have elements of apocalypticism, including reminiscent of the Hekaloth mysticism.
I know we're over time, but just a brief question / observation. I was really intrigued by what you said, that he was really addressing his own people rather than
the Gentiles.
The Gentiles. So what kind of crisis do you think he's describing here? Is it personal crisis that members of his community were possibly dealing with, or is it a class crisis?
Interesting, Eva. Well, I don't know if we can speak of a class of intellectuals in 4th century Christianity. Of course, they were there. I assume that at least in his perception, perhaps during one of his exiles, he was even exiled by Julian for a few months or so. He considered the landscape as problematic in that some intellectuals who, for one reason or another, became Christians now return to, say, the classical earlier backdrop, and he found this problematic. And like Clement in the 2nd century, but for a very different reason, he chose to bring them back or invite them back into the fold, but through the back door. Instead of accusing them of being whatever, betrayers, apostates, sinners, and so on and so forth, he took the other path of, well, it's the straw man, if you like, throw arrows at an imaginary target, so that you can understand that it's about you, and you have all the reasons in the world to return, to stick to the path, because that path is rewarding.
The way we say I'm addressing the mother-in-law, but I'm actually talking to the bride.
Or something like that. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.